Andrei, I usually approach the question of God's existence by looking into the arguments for and against God's existence, and then try to see what kind of world that would develop from that. If you would do sort of the reverse and say, okay, I'll assume God exists for the moment, and then ask how God relates to the world, see what those answers are, and then reflect back, okay, with those kinds of answers, does that give us more or less confidence that there really is a God?
Yeah, good. And actually, to tell you the truth, that's my preferred way of proceeding. I think it's first important that I think we should first think about the conception of God that we're working with, and then ask what's the evidence for that sort of a being existing. So I like that method, that way of proceeding in these sorts of debates and discussions. So I think we have to think of, like, the major options as I see it here are going to be traditional theism, of course, atheism, and then a whole spectrum of sorts of views in between. Now, I think the difficulty that traditional theism is going to be facing is twofold. On the one hand, traditional theists, I think, are going to have a really difficult time explaining how it is that something that is quite literally nowhere, how it is that that kind of a being can causally interact with the world. So now you've got God, who's described in the Judeo-Christian Islamic narratives as being a God who is an agent, as a God who not only sustains the entirety of the universe, but a God who liberates the Hebrews from Egyptian bondage, for instance, right? And this is a special act that's taking place, right? This is a God who's delivering the prophets from, all these horrible, enemies that they've got, the priests of Baal or what have you. So the difficulty that I think that traditional theists are going to have now is explaining how it is that those occurrences that are supposed to be taking place in space-time, how those causally hook up with an occurrence that's occurring wholly outside of space-time. And if, for instance, we say that God's action is going to be something that's causing these sorts of outcomes, I think the only way that we can make sense of how God's action causally brings about these particular occurrences is if God's action itself is going to be in space-time. And if God's actions are in space-time, I take it to be the case that God's actions take place within God. My actions take place within me. Similarly, I think analogously, God's actions would be taking place within God. And if that's true, then it seems to me that God is going to be spatiotemporally located. And not only spatiotemporally located, if God sustains all of reality, all of the universe at any time, then it seems to me that God must be omnispatial. So now it looks like, to the extent that God is interacting with the universe, God is doing so as an omnispatial agent.
Certainly, that has to be the end result.
I think that is the end result. Yes,
it
absolutely.
has to be.
Yeah, it has to be.
You're right.
Yeah.
The argument from theists, of course, is that if God created the universe, and certainly as God sustaining the universe, however God does that, if you are sustaining it so that if God did not have the active step of sustaining, if it just stopped sustaining, did nothing, everything would disappear.
Right, yeah.
And if that were the case, then it is a small matter to intervene, to cause the 10 plagues on Egypt, to take your example.
Right.
That's a trivial matter.
Right. And I think, of course, traditional theism is going to run into other difficulties. Of course, it's going to run into difficulties that are going to come from, in this case, the principle of conservation of energy, of course, right? So to the extent that we want to be scientifically serious, right? We want to take seriously discoveries in this case, physics. It seems that traditional theism is going to be running afoul not only of these sorts of, if you will, these sort of rarefied metaphysical debates about pairing up stuff and all that kind of stuff. Right. It's not just that. It just seems that it's contradicting our best physics, which says that you can't introduce energy from outside of this system, which is the universe. And that's what's going on when God is interacting. Yeah. So that, again, seems to be another sort of consideration that's counting against the sort of view of God as interacting from outside. So that tells me that if God is interacting with the whole, then God must be doing so as part of the whole, or as being in some way identical with the whole.
So this question about how God relates to the world, if you take it seriously, you are now moved to a different conception of God than the traditional personal being outside of space-time and with all the omnis.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
So what kind of God does that move you to, and how does that kind of God interact with the world?
Yeah. I think the kind of God that it moves at least me to is going to be some sort of a pantheistic God. I prefer describing my view as pantheism because it seems like it's a bit more of an honest label. Now, how does that God interact with the world? That ends up becoming a bit more tricky, right? So,
Well, your pantheism is where God is the world.
God is the world, exactly.
So
Right.
if you're a pantheist, if you want to put that label on yourself, does that question even a meaningful question? How God interacts with the world? If God is the world, it's just like a definition, and it seems to make the question meaningless.
Well, I think, well, it's not obvious that it makes the question meaningless, and here's the reason why. I can interact with parts of myself, right?
Okay.
So now I think of myself as an organism, let's say, right? And I can interact.
You scratch your hand.
Right, I scratch my hand, right? Let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, that God ends up being, let's suppose the universe can be described as, a big object, right? There's going to be spatiotemporal parts of that object with which I take it that God, right, constituting the totality, can in some way interact. But again, I think that's really tricky, right? So I think if we want God to be able to if we want to be able to describe God as an agent, I think a particular burden that the pantheist has and needs to take more seriously is how it is that we can in fact speak truthfully of God as an agent. And exactly how that's done, I think, is really, really hard. Exactly how to figure out how to do that.
But you still prefer it to theism.
I still prefer it to traditional theism, yes.
Why?
For a variety of reasons. Well, for one, there are the considerations that I brought up just a moment ago about God acting in the world.
So it's even though it's hard for the pantheist to get God acting as an agent,
Yeah.
it's a better set of problems than having a non-physical God interacting with the world.
Right, I think so. I mean, if I'm considering various sorts of desiderata in formulating a theory, one of them, I think, is going to be that it needs to avoid these sorts of difficulties, these sorts of conceptual, metaphysical difficulties, and also you want one that's going to be consistent with our best science. And it seems to me that traditional theism isn't satisfying either of those desiderata. So that's, I think, reason enough to jettison traditional theism and to start considering other sorts of options. And it seems that, to me at least, that some variant of pantheism is going to be the most promising way to go. I may change my mind and slip towards the panentheist approach or something down the road. So as I see it then, the options that we have then, and the one that I want to avoid, is going to be traditional theism on the one hand, because that's not going to be consistent with certain sorts of metaphysical considerations and conceptual difficulties. But then also, we want to avoid a theory of God that's going to be inconsistent with our best science. So our options, then I take it, are going to be either atheism or some variant of pantheism, and my preference is to go with pantheism.